الحضور الكريم مع حفظ الألقاب. بنرحب بضيف مهم بروفيسور ليرشك بالسيروفيتش، صاحب خطة بالسيروفيتش اللي غيرت الواقع الاقتصادي البولندي عام 1990 ونقلت بولندا اقتصاديا وطبعا ما يتبع ذلك إلى وضع مختلف تماما، بحيث تضاعف الناتج القومي الإجمالي لبولندا 7 مرات بعد هذه السنوات من الإصلاح الاقتصادي. بروفيسور بالسيروفيتش شغل منصب وزير المالية، نائب رئيس الوزراء، محافظ البنك المركزي، وهو خبير مشهور عالميا في قضايا الاقتصاد، بروفيسور في جامعة الاقتصاد في وارسو، وله الكثير من المؤلفات حول مواضيع الاقتصاد. وبنرحب فيه في جامعة بيرزيت. وتفضل بروفيسور بالسيروفيتش، أهلا وسهلا فيك. yeah.
It's okay. Shall I start or shall I wait? Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for coming in such an impressive number. I am not going to speak for 1 hour, that's too long, but say up to 40 minutes on the most important topic of economics and most important topic, I think, in policies, which is economic growth, as measured usually by the GDP. By the way, if anything is not clear, please ask. Either during my presentation or after. And I try to leave as much time as possible for the discussion. Usually there are many questions. Now, 300 years ago, all the countries were poor, which meant that 99% of the population was very, very poor and 1% was rich. And then something happened. Some countries started to grow economically, while other countries did not grow. And with the passage of time, a huge gap in the standard of living of the masses has emerged. You might remember from history that the first country to start growing in a systematic way was Britain. Then other countries of Western Europe, France, Germany. The first country which did not belong to the West but started to grow was Japan. Major reforms in the 70s of the 19th century. North America started to grow earlier, United States, because there was the transmission of the similar system from Britain. In Latin America, economic growth started even later. In Eastern Europe, later. In 1950, per capita income in Poland and Spain was the same. But in 1990, Poland had only 42% of the Spanish per capita income. So different countries at different dates started to grow, and some countries are still not growing. And if you don't grow, then, as I said, masses of the population remain poor. And no outside assistance can substitute for domestic economic growth. And this is why I said it's the most important social and economic questions. What allows countries to grow and what prevents. So what makes countries remain poor? And we know a lot. I am not saying that we don't know everything, but I think we know the basic things. And I would like to share some thoughts on that. And you may approach this question, what allows countries to grow and what prevents countries to grow, at three levels, from the most superficial to the deeper level, like that, yes? Now the first level is pretty clear. In order to grow, you have to be innovative. Innovative does not need to mean that you invent everything. There is no sense in inventing America. It has been already discovered. So countries which are poor but start growing largely rely on technology transfer. This was the case of Japan. They rely on technology transfer. This is the case of Poland when we started to grow. I come to that later. They largely relied on the technology transfer. But to be able to benefit from technology transfer, you have to meet certain conditions. And this is the second level. But still on the first level, the most important factor is to absorb new technology, not only hardware but software, new business models, etc. Then employment. So to allow more and more people to work. Because if only few people work, you cannot get rich. And there are many countries when few people work, especially women. So it's important that women are not preventing from entering the professional life. And the third factor is, at the first level, how many accidents happen. Accidents meaning breakdown. You have a crisis. And crises usually mean that economic growth goes in the reverse. So you are losing. There is a decline in per capita income. Like, say, recently in Greece. They lost, for the last 7 years, 25% of GDP due to a crisis. So it's better to prevent, not to have too frequent crises. This is the first level. Now, what explains differences at the first level? Take innovativeness, including technology transfer. We know for sure that socialism cannot work. When I say socialism, I mean a system which existed until recently in the former Soviet Union, in Poland, in former Czechoslovakia, etc. Because socialism was anti-capitalism. Socialism as the system was that everything has to be state-owned. So private enterprises were prohibited. And how can you prohibit private enterprises to emerge? Well, first you nationalize the private enterprises, and then you prohibit creation of new private enterprises. You declare this as a crime. Second, socialism meant in practice that markets, free transactions were banned. And instead of that, there was a so-called central planning, or in other words, command economy. And these two features were sufficient to prevent economic growth after a while. And there is no country in the world which had this sort of socialism which has been successful, compared to a reasonably efficient private market economy. And we have lots of striking examples. The most striking is South and North Korea. This is the same culture. but two very different systems. North Korea, as you certainly know, is an ultra-Stalinist socialist country. So private ownership is prevented, very repressive. South Korea, since the beginning of the 60s, turned into export-oriented capitalistic economy. At the beginning of the 60s, these two countries were equally poor. In 2003, North Korea had only 7% of South Korean per capita income. This was sufficient. 50 years of a difference, and even less, 40 years of a difference, huge difference in systems was sufficient to create such a huge difference in the standard of living. Oh, compare East and West Germany. This is another natural experiment. The same culture, but two different systems since 1945. In East Germany there was socialism, meaning anti-capitalism. And in West Germany they have a free market economy. Now, after 50 years, East Germany had about 30%, 30-40% of West German per capita income. So they have lost lots of time. So we know that Karl Marx was wrong and Adam Smith was right, basically. Unfortunately, Karl Marx was very popular among certain intellectuals which have conquered states like Bolsheviks in Russia, and they imposed the system upon the Russians, and then they created Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union imposed the system on Poland, former Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, etc. And all these countries have lost lots of time. I will come to that in the second part when I say something about experience after collapse of socialism. But this is the main lesson. The second lesson at the second level, besides having a free market economy with lots of competition, but within the framework of a good law. You need good law, which will respect individual liberties, good justice system. So this is absolutely indispensable, but also education. High level of education, including physical sciences, mathematics, not only social sciences. I think everybody should be pretty good in mathematics, computer science, logic. Even if one wants to be a humanist. These are the basics, absolutely necessary basics. So as I said, we know what works and what does not work at the first level and the second level. Then let us come to the third level. We know what policies are bad, what policies are good, but how is it that in some countries bad policies are employed and produce poverty, and some other countries good policies, and we come to political economy or politics. Generally speaking, there are some bad regimes which want to perpetuate power. In North Korea, it's a criminal regime, but they maintain power. Soviet Union was not a good regime, but it maintained power for such a long time. Even when you have a democracy, then sometimes you have bad policies, because some of the bad policies are popular. And if too many people believe in economic miracles, they are punished. Do not believe in economic miracles. Believe in private entrepreneurship and work. And do not believe that politicians could be Santa Claus. Only gifts. If politicians promise quite a lot, they should be very distrusted. Very distrusted. Expect from the politicians and demand from the politicians telling the truth. What are the problems? And what would be the solutions? Different than miracles. And of course, political conditions differ across countries, and the possibility to press the politicians differs too. Yes. But as I said, even in democracies, there are huge pressures for bad policies. Because some people like to get others' people money via the state. Social assistance, etc., etc. And if spending on social aims is too large, then first you have high taxes, and then there are some people who rely on social spending and are not working. And this hampers job creation. And there is no good life without jobs. And there is no economic growth without job creation. And another lesson is that public authorities usually do not create good jobs. And if you create too much jobs, you have too much bureaucracy, like in Greece. So one has to look on the private sector. How many jobs is the private sector capable of and willing to create? And if the private sector is prevented from creating jobs, or incentives are too weak, then expansion of the public sector is not a solution to poverty, to economic growth. And this is a general lesson all across, I think, the world. Now, again, at the third level of policies, I mentioned that crises are bad for the economy because it's like an accident. You drive a car, and all of a sudden you have an accident, so you cannot go on. What causes the deepest crisis? The most painful crisis, growth breakdowns. There is a cliché that it is the market, capitalism. And of course there were crises under market economies, but they were not the deepest crisis. The deepest, most painful crisis, sometimes unfortunately even associated with genocide, happened under dictatorial system without markets. So when there's a very heavy concentration of political power, Stalin in the former Soviet Union, there was not a market economy. There was a cruel dictatorship. Mao Zedong in China, cruel dictatorship. Or Khmer Rouge, and some other examples. Why? And there were millions of people who died. It was not only a collapse of the economy, but it was a genocide. Why did it happen? If you have an uncontrolled rulers, from time to time there are psychopaths. And psychopaths have weird ideas, and they are not prevented from implementing them, like these gentlemen, Stalin, Mao Zedong, or Pol Pot. But there are also less dangerous individuals who are just short-sighted or not competent and can't do anything. Fidel Castro, he was very popular outside Cuba. So what he did, he decided that there's one solution to the Cuba's problem, to extend the production of sugar. But it was a catastrophe. Khrushchev, who came after Stalin, he had a very simple solution to Soviet Union problems. He went to the United States and seen fields full of corn. And he decided that every field in the Soviet Union should be cultivated with corn. And this was a catastrophe. In Poland in the 70s, we have a very handsome ruler. Tall guy, very handsome. And he decided to solve Poland's problems by borrowing abroad. And the idea was that we would first borrow abroad, then modernize the economy, pay back the debt, and everybody would be happy. But unfortunately, only the first part of the strategy was implemented. We borrowed abroad. But the money was wasted. on various stupid projects. Because under socialism, all the economic decisions are politicized. And this is a danger, politicized. So, as a result, we were a bankrupt country. We were very heavily in debt. In the Czech Republic, there were also bad rulers, but of a different sort. So that crisis happened in the part of the former socialist economies. In Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. So we are not better off. We are worse off. Why? Because rulers were not controlled. There were no division of powers, nothing. So remember, the lesson is, if you want to prevent a deep crisis, you have to limit the political power by checks and balances, by a very active public opinion, who monitors, if possible, what the rulers promise and what they do. Without that, they would go for wrong policies. This is not to say that under democracy and capitalism you don't have problems. Of course you have. And from time to time, there are bad policies. For example, increasing spending by increasing public debt. But under democracy, if you have bad policies, it is because of the voters. Too many voters believe in economic miracles. And too few are controlling those who promise. So in democracy, you need active public opinion to monitor the politicians. And to say whenever they promise something without giving the figures, especially how much would it cost, to ask them and to press them and to have a very educated discussion. And since you have different distribution of, say, status voters and free market voters, you have different results. Like in Greece, for the last 30 years, they were all believing in Santa Claus, or they were pretending to believe. They wanted to get jobs from the state and money from the government, and it ended very sadly. So we have what are the main lessons also at the third level. I remember, first level, innovations and avoiding deep crisis. Second level, free market economy without the rule of law and limits on political power. And third level, whenever you can, try to control the rulers in your society. This is indispensable. So this was the first part, what I wanted to share with you as a general introduction. And the second part, what happened after the collapse of socialism. And there's a lot of research experience. Let me repeat that socialism was a very bad system. Socialism in the sense of prohibition of private ownership. I defined in this way. But this was how Karl Marx defined socialism. He was against private ownership, against markets. And he promised a paradise. In turnout, it was a gulag. Be very distrustful of collectivist utopias. Collectivist utopias are very dangerous. Okay, so, and socialism was never introduced via democracy, systematic democracy, starting from the very beginning. The Bolsheviks have imposed by terror and maintained it by terror and indoctrination. In China, after the Second World War, more the civil war, and then indoctrination and terror. And then in Central and Eastern Europe, it was imposed because of the Red Army. We have not voted for socialism. We would never vote for socialism. The same goes for the Czechs, the Slovaks, Romanians. So it was never a democratically introduced socialism. Because usually people want to have some freedom, including economic freedom. So it was a great event for us when socialism collapsed. It was like a miracle. Nobody expected. which means that from time to time there are nice surprises. You cannot take them for granted, but they are nice surprises. Really, nobody expected that the Soviet Union would be dissolved in a peaceful way, like it happened. It was the president of Russia, his name was Yeltsin, who dissolved the Soviet Union and withdrew Russia from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union stopped to exist. We in Poland started earlier, and in then whole Eastern Central Europe. In Poland, it was the first non-communist government in September 1989. I had the pleasure to be in charge of the economy, which was in a very bad shape. And then we have other countries, Velvet Revolution in former Czechoslovakia, which then split into two countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, etc., etc. So there was a living, and the change, final change in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, happened starting from the 92, except for the Baltic countries. Very small but extremely brave countries which withdrew from the Soviet Union earlier. Okay, so what do we know after this big event? Well, first we know that initially all the countries of the former Soviet bloc seemed to go in the same direction, meaning democracy. Democracy means political competition. Elections without political competition are not democracy. So you need free elections and permanent, systematic elections. Okay, so towards democracy, towards the rule of law. What does it mean? Difficult to define, but first of all it means that the powers of secret police are limited. The secret police acts under the law. And you have honest judiciary, which is not biased, not politicized. And you have so-called due process. So people who do not commit crimes, normal crimes, could feel safe vis-à-vis the state. So this is more or less the basic of the rule of law. So of course under socialists there was no rule of law. If you were criticized the authorities, you were the enemy of the state. So after collapse of socialism, countries started to move towards the rule of law, to division of powers. And third component of this transition was moving from non-market socialist economy to a private market economy. And during the first 2 years it seemed that everybody was moving in these directions. But then changes started to appear. Some countries reversed to dictatorship. In Belarus, the President Lukashenko has won elections and then decided no more elections. Or pseudo-elections. In Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, they quickly, Uzbekistan, they quickly returned to dictatorship. And Russia. Russia is a more complicated story. Because under President Yeltsin, you might have heard, he was, I think, a great guy. I met him several times. He was very courageous. He drank a little too much vodka. But nevertheless, he made it difficult. Not because of vodka, he made these brave decisions. No. He was just a courageous guy. Well, they were moving towards democracy. There were genuinely free elections, to more rule of law, and towards market economy. But political conditions for these reforms were more difficult in Central and Eastern Europe. There was more resistance, and President Yeltsin was weaker in the second term than in the first term. He allowed some non-reformers to enter the government, so policies were very hesitant. And they suffered because of that very serious financial crisis in 1998. And most people blamed this crisis upon reforms. They were wrong, but there was this their subjective feeling because they were told we are making reforms, and all of a sudden there was a crisis. The crisis was provoked not by reforms, but by very bad fiscal policy. They started to spend a lot by borrowing a lot from abroad. And then there was a collapse. And then President Yeltsin has made what I think the worst decision of his life. He proposed Putin for the president. And under the Putin, you've heard about President Putin. Okay. Well, and Putin came in the best moment for himself, because it could not get worse. It could only get better. There was the bottom of the crisis, and prices of oil and gas have been rising. Standard of living has been recovering, so most people said he's a good ruler. And for the first 3 years, he continued, or he did not reverse the direction set by Yeltsin. But then he started to reverse. First, he de facto liquidated democracy. So you know who would win presidential elections? Putin. Where there's less rule of law, because the power of KGB is much more extended. And you have political assassinations. And third, he also have distorted the economy in 3 ways. First, he politicized the economy by some nationalizations. And second, even if you're a private owner, you never know how long are you going to be a private owner. I call it a temporary private ownership. Because you have to have political connections or connections to KGB, and you have a stronger political connections, you can finish off your competitor. But if you have weaker connections, you are finished off. So under such a system, there are no incentive to invest. There are incentive to flight with the capital. And there's a huge capital flight in Russia. Second policy was to make the financial sector very fragile. There are most state-owned banks. State-owned firms are usually not independent from the politicians, so they make some bad decisions. And since capital escapes from Russia, they have to borrow in the West. So they are dependent on the Western financial markets. And third, Russia is increasingly dependent on export of gas and oil, from 50% to 70% participation in exports, which makes it very vulnerable to price fluctuations. And this is happening. So even before what the Russian state has started to do in Ukraine, Russia was facing stagnation. With this Putin model, I don't think Russia can grow, because private entrepreneurship has been shrunk. And there is increased politicization, etc., etc. If you are interested in what has happened later, then I am ready to say a few words. So, we have different, it turned out that after collapse of a very bad system, there were different evolutions. One can say that Central and Eastern Europe has managed to introduce and to keep democracy. So political competition, not always very elegant, not always in a very good taste, but usually political competition is better than political monopoly, as it is the case with the economy. Now, there have been also, as it turned out, huge differences in economic growth. After 1989, and I am happy to say that for some reasons Poland's economy has increased by over 100%. So per capita income in Poland has doubled. If you compare 2013 with or 14 to with 89, the level of 89. And on the other hand, you have Ukraine, when the present level is still lower than it used 25 years ago. So the huge difference. And then other countries are in between. So I just would mention that Russia has increased its per capita income. Let me look at the data. Just a second. Yes, I have it. By 12% only. Poland by over 100%. Then you have Hungary by 40%. Czech Republic by 42%. Slovakia by 60%, etc., etc. So there are huge differences. Whenever there are huge differences in economic outcomes, then of course there is a lot of research which aims at explaining what were the reasons for these differences. So there is no need to speculate. There is a lot of research. This is one of the recent books, The Great Rebirth, Lessons from the Victory of Capitalism over Communism. And there are cross-country studies and the country studies on that. So let me say at the end, what are the main findings about the reasons for these differences? We don't know everything, but I think the main lessons are pretty clear. And they are more or less consistent with the previous general lessons. And the first general lesson is this. Countries which started market reforms early, which have not delayed the reforms, and which have also stabilized the economy at the beginning, and which accumulated more reforms, are achieving better results. Because they created a better system for the economy, for private business. And I can say that we tried to be rather quick and to reform, meaning introducing competition, dismantling monopolies, allowing private sector to grow, privatizing state-owned enterprises, which took more time. On the other hand, in Belarus, they have reversed direction. In Ukraine, for some reasons, the economic change was more or less delayed by 4 years. And in Poland, we started to introduce radical reforms in 3 months, and then more or less maintain the course. So this is the first reason. Try to get to a better system quickly, if possible, in a sustained way, and prevent the reversals. Because then you have a better engine for growth. I mentioned stabilization. You don't need it here, I think. But in Poland, when we started in 1989, we have hyperinflation in the range of 2,000% a month. So it was very important to put it down, and we did it. I think the second lesson is that healthy public finance is very important for economic growth. What does it mean, healthy public finance? Not too high spending, which is necessary to have moderate taxation. No persistent deficits, and no growing public debt. And we know this lesson from many, many cases. I think one reason why there's a difference in economic growth between Poland and Hungary is that in Hungary the fiscal situation was much worse than in Poland. I am not saying that in Poland was ideal, but was not as bad as in Hungary. So you cannot buy economic growth in the longer term by increasing public spending. You can, at the most, stimulate the economy but not always. Because if you are already heavily in debt, where would you get the money from? So fiscal discipline, it's very important for economic growth. And the third lesson is that in practice it is easier to reform the enterprise sector when you start after socialism than other sectors, like public administration, like health system, like the justice system. And the greatest successes were in the enterprise sector, I think in Poland, in other countries, because if you have a problem, if your enterprises are not efficient, it is usually for one or two reasons, or two reasons at the same time. They are politicized by state ownership, and or they do not face competition. And then what you have to do? Privatize and liberalize the economy so that enterprises are facing competition. This is not pleasant to them, but it's very important for the people. And countries which did it, including Poland, have achieved quite good results. While it's more difficult, even though it's possible, to reform the justice system, police, prosecutors, judges, or the health system. You cannot and should not use privatization, of course. Privatization with respect to this system is called corruption. But corruption is not a reform. So we need other lessons. But again...
أنا راح أعلق على المحاضرة اللي سمعتها اللي ما كنت شايفها، فلذلك يعني تعليقي هو ملاحظات مبدئية. وفي تعليقي أنا بدي أعتمد على نظرية النسبية relativity theory. عندي 5 ملاحظات. أنا مش متأكد تماما إنه Are you okay?
Now I start getting translation.
Okay. What I said is that I'm going to use relativity theory in my response. مش متأكد إنه المحاضر يعني أن الاشتراكية لا تنفع بالمطلق وأن الديمقراطية الرأسمالية تنفع بالمطلق ودائما، لأنه إذا كان هيك الموضوع بيكون في عنا إشكالية. أنا مؤيد للنظام الديمقراطي ولحرية القطاع الخاص في العمل، ولكن لازم ننتبه إلى أنه إذا كان الحكي هو بالمطلق حول السماح للقطاع الخاص بالمطلق بالعمل والتجارة الحرة بالمطلق، بدنا نفسر أو بدنا جواب حول كيف نحد من الفروقات داخل الدولة الواحدة، ومش فقط داخل الدولة الواحدة وإنما في النظام الدولي، كيف نحد من الفروقات ما بين الدول. شو بنعمل بأفريقيا ودولها؟ شو بنعمل في دول عديدة اللي ما عندها القدرة الكاملة على المنافسة؟ وأنا بحكي هون من الناحية النسبية، لأنه ممكن أنك أنت تحقق نمو اقتصادي بنسبة معينة، ولكن في غيرك بحقق نمو اقتصادي في نسبة أعلى منك. ودائما الأمر متروك للمنافسة. فالمنافسة هل تسمح في نهاية المطاف لمجتمعات كاملة بأنها تكون قادرة على أنها تحقق الحد الأدنى المطلوب إنسانيا؟ فهي نقطة. النقطة الثانية، لما يعني أنا سؤالي هون إذا في علاقة واضحة مثبتة ما بين النظام الديمقراطي الرأسمالي من جهة وما بين النمو الاقتصادي من جهة أخرى. ودائما الكورليشن هي إنه مشان تحقق نمو اقتصادي لازم تكون أنت ديمقراطي رأسمالي. لأنه أنا بقدر إني أعطي مثالين ثلاثة. كوريا اللي ذكرت، كوريا الجنوبية، من أوائل الستينات حتى 79 كان رئيسها جنرال بارك هو مؤمن بالحكم المطلق وحكم بشكل مطلق. والنمو الاقتصادي الهائل اللي صار في كوريا هو نتيجة عمله. امبارح أو أول امبارح توفى رئيس وزراء سنغافورة اللي حكم بشكل مطلق، واللي العالم الغربي كان ينتقده لأنه لحقوق سجله في حقوق الإنسان. تركيا اللي حققت هذا النمو الهائل كل 10 سنوات كان في انقلاب عسكري والجيش كان متحكم في تركيا. لذلك الكورليشن مش واضحة تماما، انه متطلب اساسي لانك تحقق نمو اقتصادي انك لازم تكون رأسمالي ديمقراطي. وثالثا النظام الرأسمالي الديمقراطي، وانا هنا سؤالي او يعني وانذكر في المحاضرة بس كان لازم بجوز انه يعني يصير في عليه إلابوريشن وشرح أكثر، اللي هو كيف نضمن أن النظام الديمقراطي الرأسمالي لا يؤدي إلى تعسف طبقة شريحة داخل المجتمع. كيف نفسر بيل جيتس في $80 بليون ثروة وتحت مكتبه في ناس هومليس؟ ثروة لشخص of $80 billion and we have homeless in the States. إذا كان الاعتماد فقط هو على مشاركة المجتمع المدني ورقابة من المجتمع المدني، من المشاركين، من الجمهور، من الشعب على حكوماته، كيف نفسر تدني مستوى أو تدني نسبة التصويت في الانتخابات في العالم الديمقراطي؟ بأمريكا 50 ل 55% بروحوا بصوتوا. إذا التصويت هو في هاي النسبة القليلة، فكيف نتوقع أنه الشعب المشارك هذا بده يراقب ويحط حدود للدولة؟ وهنا في سؤالين أو ثلاثة على الموضوع. وين راحت هاي المراقبة في 2008 في أمريكا لما صار الانهيار المالي؟ في عندنا أزمة في دول أوروبية عديدة في نظام اليورو، إسبانيا، اليونان، إيرلندا، وفيها مشاركة ديمقراطية وحكم ديمقراطي. وكيف بنفسر توجه الناخبين في اليونان في الانتخابات الأخيرة اللي جابوا لنا حزب يساري اشتراكي مشان يحل لهم الأزمة اللي وقعهم فيها نظام ديمقراطي رأسمالي؟ هدول هم الثلاث ملاحظات الأساسية على المحاضرة. ملاحظتين الأخيرات هم على أن العرب لم يذكروا في المحاضرة، لأنه العالم العربي هو ما قبل الاشتراكية وما قبل الديمقراطية الرأسمالية. بعدنا ما قبله، في أحسن أحوال العالم العربي الدول المستقرة سياسيا هي دول رعوية، دول رعوية، الدول اللي بتدفع لمواطنيها. وعندنا مشاكل كبيرة من مصر للعراق لليبيا لكل العالم العربي اللي يعني. فلذلك احنا الشروط الثلاثة اللي انوضعت في اول المحاضرة حول الابداع وحول كذا هاي مش موجودة عندنا. احنا اذا عن الدول اللي عندها شوية مصاري او كتير مصاري هي ما بتشتغل بالابداع على الاطلاق، بتشتغل في الاستهلاك بالمطلق. فوضعنا العربي وضع صعب جدا في يعني ظل المحاضرة وشروط اللي انحطت في المحاضرة. وأخيرا الوضع الفلسطيني خارج المعادلة بالكامل، لأنه لا في قطاع خاص ولا في إمكانية لنمو اقتصادي. احنا اعتماديتنا بالكامل على السلطة، واعتمادية السلطة بالكامل على المساعدات الخارجية، والسبب في ذلك هو الاحتلال. فلذلك لا نظام اشتراكي ولا ديمقراطي راس مالي بنفعنا مشان نحل أزمتنا الخانقة اللي احنا مضطرين انه ندفع بالشهر، كل شهر نوفر حوالي 240 مليون دولار مشان فاتورة رواتب ومستلزمات أساسية مشان نخلي السلطة قادرة إنها تعيش. وهاي المستلزمات إذا ما أجانا كل ضرائبنا وجمركنا فبنكون موفرين حوالي 55% منها، والباقي بدنا مساعدات خارجية مشان نوفيها. لذلك لما بروح من عنا الجمرك بنصفي إن مش قادرين حتى نوفر نص احتياجاتنا، فوضعنا صعب. شكرا جزيلا على محاضرة عظيمة.
شكرا كثير دكتور علي على التعقيب القيم. وبروفيسور يشلموا if you please can you answer those good questions I think.
Well, I am not quite sure I grasped everything. And what I understood, I am not quite sure I have to respond to every remark, but to some I can. Africa. A huge differentiation in Africa, and there are many more and more successful countries in Africa. Who are these successful countries? Those who introduce more market reforms, which were introduced in some other countries before. There are certain exceptions, of course. There are different rulers. And also geography plays a certain role. If you are landlocked or isolated for some other reasons, then of course it's very difficult to grow. And there are some, I am speaking about Africa, but I understand what was said at the end. Then it's very difficult to expand the private sector. But Africa shows also that once you can reform, introduce better conditions for the private firms, you can be successful. On the relationship between democracy, non-democracy, and kind of the economic systems. Yes, I understand. First, what we know for sure, that socialists cannot be democratic. When I say socialist, let me repeat, I mean the system which actually existed, which prohibited private firms and markets. There was no one instance of democratic competition. We had elections without competition. We had elections without choice. This was not democracy. It was called people's democracy. There were some cruel jokes, I remember, like, what's the difference between democracy and people's democracy? Like between the chair and electric chair. It's pretty harsh, but this was really a difference. Now, in Putin's Russia, he speaks about sovereign democracy. But it's not democracy. I think the best is to define democracy by systematic competition. And then to have systematic competition, you need civil rights, meaning freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, free media. Only then you can compete. And under socialists, this did not exist. And one can show that this could not exist. So, if you want, democracy requires capitalism. But it does not mean that every capitalist, that whenever you have capitalism, you have democracy. There, as it was mentioned, I understand, in South Korea or Taiwan, until recently, they had non-democratic regime, but they had capitalism, and under these non-democratic rulers, they had pretty good policies. Also in Singapore. But most of the non-democratic rulers are very bad. And the worse non-democracies are much worse than the worst democracies, in the sense that atrocities which happened under some dictatorships have been much worse than the best excesses under democracy. And so this is, so democracy, in the sense political competition, is a certain guarantee against worse outcomes, but it is not sufficient to have very good outcomes. To have very good outcomes, which are resulting from good policies, as I said, you need very active civil society, which monitors the politicians. Now, I did not say that in a good system everything should be private. No. I said that firms should be private. But besides, in a good system, you have a thriving civil society, you have various charities, self-help organizations, various NGOs, and they are very important. And also you need the state, which is non-private by definition. But the point is to have such a state which is not paralyzing people, which performs very well certain basic functions, which is the justice system and protection against elementary crimes. And even though everybody would like to have a good state, it is very difficult to get one. And many states are bad. They are performing too many functions, they intervene, they paralyze, they are corrupt. So no state, not having a state is bad, because then you don't have a basic protection against aggression. But having an overgrown state, it's another case of a bad situation. I don't know, I am not quite sure I understood what was said about this low turnout. Yes, you mentioned that in the West, disproportions, inequalities. This is a very hot issue and very emotional and large and understandable. But I think at the very beginning, what should distinguish between two kinds of equality, equality of opportunity. It's very important. What does it mean? That people who have the same personalities and talents should have the same chances of achieving their professional goals. They should not be prevented by the fact they are poorer or come from distant localities. This is a very important ideal, a liberal ideal. And to get closer, you have to get good education. You should have free markets so that entrepreneurship can be successful, not because of political connections, but because they are just better. They have better ideas, etc. So it's a very important idea. And we know that the best extent of inequality of opportunity is zero. This is the idea we should strive to. What about inequality of income? Would we say that zero is the best? So regardless whether you are lazy or hardworking, whether you are educated or non-educated, you should get the same pay? Of course not. So you see that here there is just no simple numerical ideal. So I think the best is to say we should try to get closer to equality of opportunity within the large framework of freedom, and then to accept the resulting inequalities of situation or income. That's the first thing. And then second, of course, we should care about the poor people. Poverty, not inequality. Poverty is important. And to deal with poverty, it's not only via the state. In a poor country, when you have a large welfare state, you would remain poor. When Sweden started its economic growth, Sweden was very poor in the late 9th century. And they started with a free market economy. They were growing. Once they get richer, they expanded the welfare state. A little too much, because then they have a problem. But it's very important to realize that helping the other poor people should not be the monopoly of the state. The civil, the family, religious organization, non-religious organization are extremely important to that. So, first distinguish between inequality of income, inequality of opportunity, and focus on poverty eradication via the civil society, not on the state. What else? I think Greece was mentioned, yes. But Greece, as I said, had huge problems. Because in Greece's politics, they voted usually for increased spending and increased public employment, bureaucracy. But this was not due to free market. This was due to bad politics. And to be more precise, Greece was a disciplined country between 1950 and 73-75. They had no persistent budget deficit, and they were one of the fastest growing countries in Europe, growing at about 6%. So one cannot say it is the Greek mentality which produces these problems. Bad politics. What happened? They had a very gifted, talented demagogue. And his name was Papandreou. He was a professor of economics. Of the most abstract branch of economics, which is welfare economics. But at the same time, he was a gifted populist. And he expanded the welfare state. He promised the voters more spending. And he delivered. And he poisoned the political culture in Greece because his opposition started to compete who would give more. So you had two bad parties competing via bad policies. Who was financing, to some extent, this bad competition? European Union. Via funds. They grow, economic growth slowed down very much. But there was no genuine no good competition until they collapsed. So in democracy, as I said, one needs a very active civil society to monitor the politicians. Because it may happen you have two bad parties which compete on bad policies. To some extent in Hungary until recently. They were competing who would promise more spending and who would spend more.
Can you win elections without promises?
Yes, from time to time. Now I know that, of course, this depends what promises. You may promise what is difficult but achievable. You may promise that you would release or remove bureaucracy and constraints, that you would deregulate.
But what Arab states?
Well, there is a notion of Arab socialism. I remember that. There was a notion of Arab socialism. It was almost socialism. if you look almost. So the difference was that the share of, whenever there was Arab socialist, the difference was that the share of private sector is a bit larger. But it was not dominating. And quasi-socialism is only a little better than socialism in economic outcomes.
ناخذ أسئلة. دكتور بدك تحكي شيء؟ دكتور أوكي. أسئلة. أستاذ سميح. بالعربي.
أنا بنفس الخط اللي حكى فيه الدكتور علي بدي أطرح اعتراضين على المحاضرة أو ما طرح في المحاضرة. هناك نوع من التحليل الذي يجعل الاقتصاد أمرا مستقلا في أي دولة من الدول، وهذا بالطبع غير صحيح، لأن اقتصاد الدول يوجد فيه تداخلات دولية وعالمية. الرأسمالية أصلا لم تنمو بفعل عوامل داخلية فقط، وإنما نمت بفعل السرقة التي مارستها الدول الاستعمارية من الدول الأخرى في أفريقيا وفي آسيا وفي أمريكا اللاتينية. فلذلك لا يمكن فهم الرأسمالية وتطورها ونظامها السياسي دون الأخذ بعين الاعتبار هذه عملية السرقة التاريخية والتي ما زالت مستمرة. الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية حين يكون عندها أزمات اقتصادية تبيع أسلحة لدول العالم الثالث مثل السعودية والإمارات وغيرها من الدول وتحل هذه الأزمة. فلذلك لا يمكن دراسة الاقتصاد المحلي بعيدا عن هذه المسألة. أيضا هناك التدخلات الخارجية في مسألة الاشتراكية. يعني هل يمكن فهم انهيار الاشتراكية دون أن نأخذ بعين الاعتبار الحصار من دون أن نأخذ بعين الاعتبار الحصار الرأسمالي للدول الاشتراكية؟ أعيد السؤال.
آخر شيء.
هل يمكن فهم انهيار الاشتراكية الدول الاشتراكية دون الأخذ بعين الاعتبار التدخل من الدول الرأسمالية من خلال الحصار وغيره، كما يمارس الحصار أو مورس على كوبا وكوريا الشمالية، ويمارس على إيران ومورس على العراق. هذه معيقات كبيرة في سبيل التطور الاقتصادي في هذه الدول. لذلك دول ملاحظتين أعتقد أنه كانوا غائبات عن المحاضرة.
شكرا.
Well, this is not to deny that the legacy of colonialism was very bad, especially in some cases like Belgium. Probably the worst. Millions of people died because of Belgium, in Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, etc. But it would be an exaggeration to say that whenever there were successes in a capitalistic economy, especially after 50 years of collapse of colonies, they are only due to the legacy of colonialism. There have been very successful countries without colonies. The Nordic countries, Sweden. Poland is very successful. After 1989, we did not have colonies. While remembering that problems of some countries in Africa are exacerbated, make deeper by the legacy of colonialism, for example, borders. One cannot say that it was colonialism which is behind the successes of some capitalistic economies. And even in Africa, countries which suffered colonialism can be successful. There are differences in Africa in the successes. Now, problems of socialism were due to socialism and not interference. And I lived in socialism. There are many countries, many people who did not live under socialism. Okay. And think it was a good system. You can love socialism from a distance, but not while you live it. It was based on dictatorship, on propaganda, on lies, permanent indoctrination, lack of freedom, and backwardness. It was extremely bad system. And this is why all over Central and Eastern Europe, they've been so happy that this bad system dissolved. North Korea is one concentration camp. Million people died of hunger. There are people who are imprisoned, and not only them, children. Extremely cruel. Cuba was not as harsh, but I was in Cuba to talk to a dissident. And he was all the time monitored by his number. Then he died in the suspicious, not because of me, but because he was a dissident. Because of under very suspicious circumstances.
اوكي.
So it was not a paradox.
وين الميكروفون؟ شوي في سؤال.
لا سؤالي معلش في سؤال.
اسألوا وبعدين اوكي تفضل.
اعتقد البروفيسور ما جاوبش على سؤال ازمة 2008 2009 انه الازمة العالمية اللي بدأت في امريكا ليمان برادرز بانك بعدين انتشرت انتشار النار في الهشيم في العالم يعني
أوكي.
مع انه هاي بلد تعتبر ام الديمقراطية والسوق الحر وبالتالي هو اشار انه الازمات الاقتصادية في الدول الدكتاتورية فهمنا انظمة دكتاتورية ما فيش حرية تعبير ما فيش كومبيتيشن ما فيش منافسة فهمنا انه سبب الدكتاتورية تؤدي الى ازمات اقتصادية
لكن عن ماركس ودورة الازمات
لكن في المقابل ظهرت مثل هاي الازمات العالمية المعقدة في العالم الحر وبدأت في امريكا وبالتالي مش عارفين انه عنوان هذه المحاضرة او انه هي ما هي الاسباب الجذريه للازمه الماليه؟ هي الاسواق ولا الحكومات؟ الان في حالات الحكومات كانت سبب رئيسي للازمات وحالات اخرى ايضا في الدول الديمقراطيه واللي فيها نظام السوق الحر ايضا فيها ازمات لا تقل حجما عن الازمات.
واضح شكرا.
فبالتالي مش عارفين وين الجواب يعني.
واضح هذا بيجاوب شكرا. في شيء ثاني بشسكي؟ Yeah, you can take. We'll take more questions and we'll answer them all.
Sir, thank you very much, Professor Balcerowicz. Thank you very much for your lecture and mentioning our country several times, Czechoslovakia. You said it's difficult. It was difficult to live in socialist regime. I have to confirm that. I lived there for quite a significant part of my life as well. I just wanted to add one thing as the experience of one South African politician who told me a story of if somebody wanted to become a communist, he needed to be sent to Paris. And if somebody wanted to become an anti-communist, he was sent to Moscow. So that was the paradox of that time. And to understand exactly what the socialist regime meant. But I have two questions, if you allow me. One is you mentioned several times, and Professor Jabari also talked about the market economy and the relation between market economy, freedom of speech, freedom of free elections, say, and the growth. When I was young, living in the socialist regime, the most appealing regime was the West. I mean, the liberal democracies. I mean, for us, it was nothing else. There was no choice. If you had 2 pens and on one pen there would be written "Made in the United States," the best would be the "Made in the United States." That was clear. But now the question is, tell me, when we travel around the world, there are countries, there are people who don't see West democracies as much appealing as for us. I served in South Africa, and I've heard several times that the regime in China would be much more appropriate for them than us, which is very difficult to swallow for me as coming from Europe. But what would be your answer for that? That is one question. And the second question, you mentioned the Arab world only partially, and it was also mentioned. So my question is, you compared a couple of countries, South Korea, North Korea. You compared Poland and Spain. So where is the problem if we compare, for example, Egypt and South Korea in 50s, more or less in 1950, I mean after the Second World War, the starting point was almost the same. Now we can see where is South Korea, we can see where is Egypt, and we can maybe continue with other Arab countries. And since we are sitting here in Palestine, my question would be why Arab world is simply not growing, not moving forward, in some cases even moving backwards. So where do you see the problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, behind you. Yeah, thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank the panel, especially Professor Balcerowicz. You managed to help someone like me, who is very ignorant in economics, have a little bit more insight into a very complex issue. I was about to raise the same issue raised by our friend on, the fact that certain countries, non-democracies like Cuba and North Korea face sanctions. But I think I've been to Cuba, not to North Korea. I think this raises one very important issue, the issue of responsibility, taking responsibility. Because I think it is very often too convenient to use certain issues as an excuse for lack of innovation. And I think, take my country, I come from Malta. It's a very small country, 300 square kilometers, the size of Gaza, heavily overpopulated, no natural resources. We also had a colonial experience. And it wasn't, in some ways it was a good experience, in some ways it's bad. But the colonial experience also gave us something. We speak English fluently. We have a good system. We have a good system of administration. We could have easily used a lot of excuses, lack of resources, lack of size, the fact that we're an island, the fact that we have a colonialist past, keep us from making the right choices. And there was a point when we seriously risked, because of bad choices, to go down a very wrong path. And I always say, by the grace of God, that I did not grow up in a failed state. So I think it's very important to, no matter how difficult the circumstances is that you face, you can always do something. And I think this issue of responsibility is key. The other comment that I would like to make is that I grew up in a kind of semi-socialist system, which was very interesting. It never completely suppressed the private property. It never stopped the market economy. It put some controls for a short period, which I believe helped us take off, because I understand that, yes, it's very important to not let the state take complete control, but you cannot have an entrepreneuring, innovative society if people are constantly worried about where they live, whether they have access to education for their children, food on their plate, unless you have the basic. So I do see a role for the state to promote the basic. And sometimes there is a need for state intervention to stop, although I agree that this is a very slippery slope. So what I always say is that if we look in the West, I don't think socialism failed. I think a certain type of socialism has actually won, in the sense that there is no country in Western Europe that doesn't agree that the state should prefer basic healthcare, education, and possibly housing. So I always question whether capitalism won, because without a basic level of socialism, you will have revolution.
Thank you. Last question.
A brief introduction. My name is George Sousa. I'm a Palestinian European. Spent 22 years in Poland. Part of what was the transition of Poland from living under a different regime, the Soviet system, to a modern democracy. We're delighted that you're here, and I would like to take advantage of your presence here to ask you, because I'm also a physicist and a pragmatist, although we are in an educational institution, I'm sure the students behind me here are very keen to know how they can contribute to the emergence of a democracy and a viable economy in this country. One of the offers that Europe has made to the Palestinians is under the conditions of a peace agreement that Europe will provide us, meaning the Palestinians, with an exceptional relationship to Europe. Since Poland is one of the largest East European state, what do you see the possibility of an intensive cooperation program between Europe generally and specifically between Poland and our people that can do something along the lines of what we, as a Western European, did in what was called the transfer of know-how in these 20-so years under what we called the acquis system. So it's a question specific, what can we expect from Europe? Would you have your own suggestions as how you can help us think about the future of our relationship with Europe and specifically with Poland? Thank you.
شكرا فيه. Thank you.
Well, there are so many fundamental questions. Well, let me start with conceptual clarification. One has to define the meaning of the terms. So socialism, according to Marx, was a non-market, anti-private property system. This system was introduced and failed everywhere because of those anti-market and anti-private ownership. This is this one statement which is conceptual and empirical. Now, some people use this term socialism in a completely different meaning. They mean a welfare state, a large welfare state. Okay, I cannot prohibit the use of this term in a different sense, but just be clear that this is completely different. And if you define as socialism by a large welfare state, every state is socialist, including the United States. So it is useless. So let's stick to basic definitions. Just one explanation. Okay, we can discuss whether housing should be the responsibility of the government or not, but leave that aside. Experience is not very encouraging. Now, the question about the huge question about the crisis 2008-2009. First of all, not every country had the crisis. Canada had not the crisis. Poland did not have a crisis. While United States, boom and bust, Britain, within Eurozone, Ireland, Spain, Greece. So what explains why some countries have a crisis and some other countries did not have a crisis? The first question. And we know it. Those countries which for some reason did not allow the boom means accelerated spending, which is also all. Take Greece. As I said, they were spending and spending and spending because they were competing. There was a bad competition. They were increasing the public debt until they collapsed. It's difficult to blame the markets. Now, a more difficult case is whenever you have a private credit boom, housing boom. So banks are increasing credit too fast, and economy is growing, and then it collapses, like in Spain, like in Ireland, like to some extent in the United States. And most people just say, well, this is the market failure. But if you dig a bit deeper, you see certain policies which have encouraged the banks and also the clients of the banks to borrow or lend too much. For example, in the United States, there was a legislation adopted in 1990 which induced or forced the banks to lend to borrowers which were in fact not creditworthy. It was subprime legislation. In the Eurozone, credit was too cheap for countries like Spain or like Ireland. And there are some connections to certain technical details of the ECB's policies. In many countries, it is very popular to subsidize mortgages. It's because people like others people money, but then it encourages an excessive growth. Well, there is a report prepared in OECD, not OECD, this was European Union. The name is the Larosière report. I was the member of this group. And we have identified at least 10 bad interventions which have encouraged excessive growth of credit. So it's difficult to blame just markets. And also, if you have state-owned banks, they make more mistakes than private banks. I'm not saying that private banks are immune to mistakes, no. But if you compare the frequency of errors, then you see that state-owned banks or politicized banks make more mistakes because they are politicized. Look at Spain. In Spain, you have two systems. One up just private banks like Santander. The different system is called cajas in Spanish, which is banks which are called not banks. The cajas were politicized by regional politicians. So what did the cajas spend? Very popular projects, aqua parks, airports in places which did not make sense. So make huge non-performing bad loans, and then they collapse. So one of the reasons is protect banks from the politicians. Protect firms from the politicians. Not because politicians are always bad, but because they have different incentives than normal businessmen. So much, very briefly, for the first question. Now, many people, I think that somebody mentioned that so many people in the West criticize the Western system. Yes, that's fact, especially in Hollywood. You may be very popular in the West and you may earn a lot of money by being anti-capitalist. But you could not be it was not very lucrative if you were against socialism under socialism. So this is why you make a lot of, you have a lot of people who are very critical, and they can be critical, and that's very good, of their Western system. But very few of them live for Cuba. So this is a cheap criticism. And nobody lives for North Korea. Some only live for Russia. So if they prefer to stay under the system, they criticize. Okay. Now, China is another big question. I think you asked China. For the first 30 years, China was under very harsh socialism, under Mao. And then China lost 50 million lives because of 3 destructive policies of Mao. And was developing very slowly. And since once Mao died, in the late 90s, China started to change the economic system and de facto abandoned socialism. So there's no more monopoly of the state. There's a growing private sector. There's a lot of foreign direct investment. In China, you have 5 times as much foreign investment than in India. And Chinese exports are 5 times as large as in India. So China has changed its economic system without changing its political system. It's still one-party state. But this party have basically introduced reforms, allowed reforms which allowed China to grow. And China is repeating the story of Japan. Japan in the 50s, in the 60s was growing as fast as China. South Korea was growing as fast as China. And we are going to see. If they maintain the reforms, they will be growing economically speaking. And if they grow economically speaking, there will be more pressure for civil freedoms. Because there is a link. Well, what next? Well, I cannot speak for European Union. and there is an ambassador who can speak more officially for Poland. So what can I say? I know that there are some people, many people who started in Poland, and there are some of them here. I wonder whether there is a network or association which could cooperate with people in Poland. And you left very good memories. So this is a sort of a social capital which should be used. First. Second, I would not encourage you to adopt all the European legislation. That's too much. And sometimes it's too burdensome. But the best pieces, which should be selected, what is the best for the private business, for the economy, for civil society, and perhaps we can cooperate on that. Thank you.
شكرا كثير للحضور الكريم بروفيسور بالسيروفيتش. شكرا كثير.